Hi, I'm Margie Levine, Assistant Counsel with the Ethics Law and Policy Branch at the Office of Government Ethics, and I appreciate you joining me for the Seeking and Negotiating Employment Debrief. In this debrief, which will be divided into two parts, I'll walk through several exercises that involve applying the requirements in Subpart F, and that will hopefully help you in your work advising and training employees on Subpart F. This debrief session is a follow-up to the two-part training session on seeking and negotiating employment that's available for viewing on the IEG library, and it's part of the materials you receive for this debrief. And just as that presentation is geared toward newer ethics officials or those who are newer to Subpart F, so are these exercises. Watching that presentation should help you in completing these exercises, and I will include some of those slides in this debrief to help remind us of the Subpart F requirements. I'd also recommend having Subpart F of the Standards of Conduct handy as we go through these exercises. Next slide. This slide is from the related presentation on seeking and negotiating employment, and I'm including it here to remind us that there are two components to Subpart F: the recusal requirement, which comes from 18 U.S.C. 208 and the impartiality regulation, and the notification requirements, which come from the Stock Act. And we'll talk about each component in this debrief and in the exercises. Next slide. I also want to remind us of what the recusal requirement is under Subpart F. An employee who is seeking employment with a non-federal entity must recuse from particular matters that, to the employee's knowledge, affect the financial interests of the prospective employer. Next slide. Let's start the exercises. I'll read exercise 1. You are an ethics official at the Department of Transportation, DOT. A DOT employee contacts you because they're thinking about looking for other jobs, and they remember learning at a training that they have to follow certain ethics rules when job searching, but they don't recall the specifics. They ask you for more information, and specifically, whether they should avoid pursuing job opportunities from certain entities that are regulated by DOT. How would you advise them? I would note that this is a pretty open-ended question. The employee isn't giving you many facts to analyze. They apparently haven't started their job search. They want to know, what are the ethics rules regarding job searches? Regarding answering their question, how would you advise them? What are the things they must know about the ethics restrictions regarding their job search? If you're working through this exercise while viewing this recording, I'd recommend pausing the video and giving yourself a moment to jot down what you think are the critical points that employees should know about the ethics requirements regarding job searches. And on the next slide, I'll give you a list of the key items I would mention to this employee about their ethics requirements. Next slide. Here are the key things employees must know about their ethics requirements under Subpart F. Specifically, you should summarize the Subpart F recusal requirement, define seeking employment per the Subpart F definition, and it's helpful to give examples of what actions or words amount to seeking employment. And because the DOT employee brought this up, it's important to clarify that the Subpart F recusal limits government work rather than their job search. So this employee is not prohibited under Subpart F from seeking employment with entities regulated by the Department of Transportation. Rather, the question under Subpart F is this threshold question in the fourth bullet point, whether the employee has to recuse from certain matters in their government work because those matters affect the financial interests of the entities they're seeking employment with. Finally, you should note that if they're a public filer, there are additional notification requirements that may apply to them relating to their job search, and those are the Stock Act notification requirements. Next slide. Let's move on to exercise 2. So let's say you provide these must-knows, these critical subpart F requirements, and so now the Department of Transportation employee has the basics about their ethics requirements, and they come back to you with more information about their agency work and their job search plans. So here's what the employee tells you. I'm looking for jobs with car manufacturers where I could be involved in developing and improving automated vehicle technology. I currently work in DOT's National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, but my work at the agency does not involve self-driving vehicles, so I don't think my job search will create a recusal requirement. Do you agree? How would you advise them? Well, to answer their question of whether they have a recusal requirement, what information do you need, or what questions do you need to ask and answer? Next slide. To determine if the employee has a recusal requirement under subpart F, there are basically 2 questions you need to ask and answer. First, is the employee seeking employment? And does the employee work on matters that affect the financial interests of the prospective employers? Next slide. Do we have enough information to answer those 2 questions based on what the employee has told us so far? The answer is no. We don't know what actions the employee has taken or will take to explore job opportunities and whether their actions meet the definition of seeking employment. And regarding the threshold question of whether the employee works on matters that would affect the prospective employer's financial interests, all we know is that the employee does not work on matters involving self-driving vehicles. But what does he work on at the agency? And does that work affect the prospective employers? So in terms of how you would advise this employee, you'll need to let them know that you don't have enough information to address their question. You have some follow-up questions regarding whether they're seeking employment and the second threshold question of whether their work affects the prospective employer's financial interests. For the first question, whether they're seeking employment, in exercise 4, we're going to look at potential actions that this employee might take in their job search and whether those actions meet the definition of seeking employment. But first, let's look at exercise 3, which deals with this other question of what they work on and whether that work affects the prospective employer's financial interests. Because keep in mind, and this is why it's a threshold question, if the employee does not work on matters that affect the prospective employer's financial interests, the employee won't have a recusal requirement, and you won't need to get into the weeds of whether the employee has taken actions that amount to seeking employment. Next slide. So you're going to go back to the employee and ask them questions to help you determine whether they work on matters that affect the financial interests of the car manufacturers they're looking to work for. This slide gives you 2 examples of what the employee might tell you they work on. So let's say the employee comes back to you and says, I review public complaints submitted to DOT about vehicle defects and collisions. I develop the related facts, and I prepare incident reports that help the agency determine its response to the defect or collision. If this is what the employee works on, and we know they're looking for jobs with car manufacturers, what are your thoughts on whether their work may affect the car manufacturer's financial interests? It seems likely that the employee's complaint work would involve matters affecting or involving the car manufacturers that they may be applying to jobs with. And so, you could ask a follow-up question to the employee to determine whether the prospective employer's vehicles could be implicated in the employee's or affected by the employee's complaint work. I'll read the second bullet point now. I oversee the NHTSA's contracts with software companies for the provision of software and related services and products used by NHTSA personnel in their day-to-day work. If the employee's work involves overseeing the agency's contracts for its internal IT systems rather than the substantive transportation-related work of the agency, do you think the employee's work would affect the companies the employee will be applying to? If the prospective employers are car manufacturers, it's unlikely that the employee's IT work involving internal IT systems would affect car manufacturers. It's important, though, to not just limit yourself to the facts that the employee provides you. You should ask follow-up questions and stay focused on what the employee does in his agency work and how that could affect the prospective employer. And if you have any doubts about the impact on the prospective employer, definitely raise that and ask questions. And there's a lot more that we could say about whether a particular matter has an effect on an outside company, and that question really requires its own training. I would note that there are materials in the IEG library on whether a matter has a direct and predictable effect on the prospective employer for purposes of determining whether an employee who's seeking employment has recusal requirements. And that job aid is called Seeking Participant Guide and is associated with an older training that on seeking employment, truth or fiction, that is no longer up to date, but that job aid Seeking Participant Guide should be useful guidance for you. Now, in the exercises you received, there's an exercise 3, part 2. We're not going to talk about that right now, but hold on to it. We'll talk about it later in the debrief. Next slide. Let's circle back to the second question we need to address for this employee to figure out if they have a recusal requirement, which is whether their job search actions amount to seeking employment. In the related training on seeking employment, I included this slide on when seeking employment begins. Generally, as the employee reaches out to a prospective employer or intermediary about possible employment with the prospective employer, that starts the seeking employment and triggers the recusal. If it's the prospective employer or prospective employer's intermediary that initiates contact with the employee regarding possible employment, then the employee would be seeking employment if the employee makes a response other than rejection. Those are the main takeaways about what seeking employment means. And now let's look at examples of job search actions that the Department of Transportation employee might take, and we'll talk about whether those actions amount to seeking employment or not. Next slide. So in exercise 4, there are examples of potential job search actions that the DOT employee might take, and I'll read the first example. The DOT employee sends their resume to a self-driving car company. Are they seeking employment with that company that they send the resume to? Yes, sending their resume is seeking employment because it meets the regulatory definition of seeking employment. They're making an unsolicited communication to a person regarding possible employment with that person. Next slide. In the second example, the DOT employee emails their friend who works at a self-driving car company and asks if the friend is aware of any job openings at the company. The DOT employee does not attach a resume. Does this communication amount to seeking employment? Does it matter that the employee didn't send their resume? The employee appears to still meet the definition of seeking employment. They made an unsolicited communication to a prospective employer regarding possible employment. So even if the employee didn't send a resume, they're implying that they want to come work for the company. It will depend on the facts and what the email says, but if the employee is indicating their interest in being considered for employment, you should consider that to be seeking employment. Next slide. I'll read the third example. The DOT employee posts on social media that they're looking for jobs with companies involved in the development of self-driving cars, and they'd appreciate hearing from contacts about any opportunities. They attach their resume to the post. What do you think? Is the employee seeking employment? I should clarify that in this example, the employee is posting to their social media profile to no one in particular other than their full friend or contact list? The answer is no, this is not seeking employment. Because the employee's social media profile isn't targeting any one prospective employer, it's not an unsolicited communication with a particular prospective employer. And because they're not sending the resume to anyone in particular, they're not seeking employment. Next slide. So we've completed our discussion of the first three examples of whether the DOT employee's job search actions or words meet the definition of seeking employment. I'll stop part one of the debrief here, and in part two, we'll pick back up with more examples of whether certain actions or communications meet the definition of seeking employment. But in the next few examples, the actions or communications are ones initiated by the prospective employer.